I've now spent 6 months with the Panasonic GH5. During that time, it's done some serious traveling with me. Yosemite, New York, Croatia, Rome, Mount Rainier, Yellowstone, Iceland. And for some of those trips, this was my only camera, photos and videos, but for most of them, just videos. And now we have the recent release of the version 2 firmware for the Panasonic GH5 that adds a whole host of additional features. I've got that new firmware on here, and I thought this would be a great time to share my long-term review, look at some of the new firmware offerings, and share with you a few GH5 tips and tricks. All right, let's start with what I don't love, because it's not a perfect camera. The bigger size and weight. Now, I feel a little whiny when I complain about the GH5 because this camera does provide some of the best looking and stabilized 4K footage on the market at a ridiculously good price. But there are times where I miss that nice, small, lightweight GH4. GH5 is definitely bigger and heavier. I also don't love the battery life, and again, I'm comparing it to the GH4. The GH4 lasted seemingly forever on a single battery, and with the stabilized sensor in the GH5 and those higher bitrate files and the 60p at 4K, it uses a lot more juice, and I find myself switching batteries more often. And I wish it had better stabilization for stills. I love the video stabilization in here, but I've ended up shooting a fair amount of stills with this camera. I'm really happy with them, but when I compare it to something like the Olympus EM1 Mark II with those crazy long 4 to 10 second handheld exposures, I'd love to see them up the stabilization capabilities for stills in this camera as well. And the final issue that I've got with this camera, it's one I mentioned at the beginning, and it's one pretty much all reviewers mentioned, unless they're paid by Panasonic, the focusing system. In videos, it's not great, but it has been good enough for me. The new firmware states that they have improved this. I've been testing over the last couple of days. I'm not sure I see any major differences. It might be a little bit better. But when we get to the tips section of this video, I'm going to share exactly how I set up my shots for video and for travel vlogs and why the focusing system doesn't really bother me the way it currently works. Let's talk a little bit about what I love about the GH5. I mean, the headline feature has to be this beautiful 4K footage this camera is capable of producing at 30 or 60 frames per second. I mean, everything looks cooler at 60 frames per second, right? And it looks great coming right out of the camera. The Sine V profile is usually what I use, and adding a little bit of contrast in post is all that I need, and I love how it looks. Now, with version 2 of the firmware, Panasonic has offered an HDR profile. It's very close to the broadcast standard used by YouTube and your HDR-enabled TVs. You can plug the GH5 or upload directly to YouTube and see a much greater dynamic range. You are limited to a base ISO of 400, and actually at this time there's no easy way to edit this footage and export it to YouTube, keeping that HLG codec embedded in there, but it points to how forward-thinking Panasonic is. You also have the new All-I 422 format. This is a beautiful high bit rate that responds really well to editing, and it's got a little bit more detail in there, though you do need fast cards, and honestly, you gotta do some serious pixel peeping to see any real difference from what they're offering now. Now, it probably doesn't matter if you're uploading those files to YouTube. What does matter though is producing smooth footage. I love the stabilization in the GH5. I mean, this along with 4K 60 frames per second is the big reason in my mind to get the GH5 over the GH4. If you don't want or need stabilized footage without a gimbal, or you're gonna be on a tripod, or you don't care about shooting 60 frames per second 4K, GH4 is still a fine camera and nearly half the price. Another feature that I love about this GH5 is its overall speed and usability. Switching between photos and videos is fast. I could be shooting videos and seconds later stills, or vice versa. I haven't found any other camera to offer that type of speed in switching between the media. And there's so much room to grow with this camera. It's packed with features, and serious videographers I respect are adopting its use left and right. And I use about half of the features that are built in here, and about half of what's in this new firmware is really, I don't care too much about. It really comes back to that speed and ease of use. No other camera I have found is this friendly and produces this beautiful of 4K footage. Now what I want to do with you is share some tips and tricks for using this camera that I've found over the last couple of months that I think will help you out. I'm often shooting my videos by myself, and I found the GH5 to be fantastic to do that, even with its less than stellar autofocus system. So the first thing that I want to do is turn that constant autofocus off so that I know it's not going to refocus on me or the background while I'm shooting. I also, because I'm a little paranoid, turn it to manual focus so I know for sure that it won't be autofocusing during the video. Once I've done all that and I've kind of set up my framing, I'll connect via Wi-Fi to the fantastic app on the phone. In my opinion, the best app for communicating with your camera out of all of the manufacturers out there. It just works really well, reliably, allows me to continue to shoot 4K, and here's the big, lovely key. It allows me to autofocus a single time when I'm still in manual focus. So I've got the app connected to the camera, I can see myself, I can double tap on the screen to zoom in and to focus on myself, and it looks beautiful, it looks ready to go, and I can hit the record button and start talking about the Panasonic GH5 and how much I think its 4K footage is beautiful and gorgeous, and I love it. I have a few more tips and tricks that just make your experience with the GH5 a little bit smoother. The first is this eye sensor here that switches between the viewfinder and the live view monitor on the back. It's a little bit too sensitive for my tastes, and I'll find that it's often switching that monitor off when I'm still using it. The function F5 button over here on the side will cycle through those two options, and when it comes back, you're not in auto mode anymore, and that live view will stay on even when you bring this camera up close and the sensor gets triggered. That, I think, makes for a smoother experience. Another thing that I want you to realize is that these function buttons, including the one I just said, are extremely customizable, and the easiest way to get into their customization is to hold down a function button, and it will come up with everything that you can assign to that button. And the list is extremely long, and it's gotten even longer with firmware version 2. So take a few moments and really dial in the way you want to use this camera and make sure it's set up for you. Not only do you have these physical function buttons, but you have additional functions available to you in the little slide out panel on the touch screen as well. Now, as I said, I often use this camera for both photos and video, and I love long exposures and have found the Panasonic to be a fantastic long exposure camera as long as you go in the menu and turn constant preview off. Now, constant preview is great in that it shows you your exposure or a simulation of it on the back of the camera. But as you get to those really slow shutter speeds, everything starts to go really motion blurry and look a little like pudding. So you turn that off, it keeps the exposure nice and snappy, or it keeps the view and the refresh rate of the screen nice and snappy, and gives you good feedback and allows you to set up for those longer exposure shots. I love the custom modes, 3 of them that GH5 gives you on the dial. They're really easy to set. Wrench, custom set memory. 1, 2, and 3, you can just spin and get to them on the dial, and then 3.2 and 3.3 can be gotten to through the menu. I have mine set up for 4K at 30 frames per second, 4K at 60 frames per second when I'm doing B-roll that I might want to slow down, and my third custom mode is a super slow mode that gives me 1080 and a very high frame rate. I suggest you use these and update them frequently. When I enter a building and it's lower light, I'll update the 2 most used ones to have a higher ISO and a lower aperture so that I can quickly switch back and forth between the modes that I need and find them usable to me. And I've shared this tip before talking about intervalometers. You've got an intervalometer built into the GH5, and it's become more usable now with firmware update version 2, and as you start shooting, it will give you a better suggestion of how long before this video will be completed. But one of the things that I think you should use this for is family pictures. Get in there, set up a 1-second interval, get your focus on one person, start it, walk out there as a family, take a bunch of pictures. You don't have to worry about pressing a button. You can take some that are fun, smiley ones that are fun, goofy ones, and then you finish up and you're all done. And it's just a great way to quickly get a series of shots. It's the easiest way, in my opinion. I'd love to know your GH5 tips and tricks for photos or video. You can leave those in the comments below, along with any questions that you might have about this camera. And of course, I've written up thoughts on this versus the competitors, and that's linked right down below too. If you found this video helpful, give it a quick thumbs up and don't forget to hit that subscribe button and check the little bell notification so you'll be notified of future gear reviews, tips, tricks, giveaways, and more. Thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.